grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all. We gather here to commend our brother Edwin to God our Father, and to commit his body to the earth. The spirit of faith and the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, let us now offer our prayers. In Scripture we hear our Lord say, "This is the will of the one who sent me, says the Lord, that I should not lose anything of what he gave me, and I should raise it up on the last day." Lord Jesus Christ, by your own 3 days in the tomb you hollowed the graves of all who believe in you, and so made the grave a sign of hope that promises resurrection, even as it claims our mortal body. Grant that our brother may sleep here in peace until you awaken him to glory, for you are the resurrection and the life. Then he will see you face to face, and in your light will see light, and know the splendor of God, for you live and reign forever and ever. And now we come to our last farewell. There is always a sadness in parting, and we take comfort in the hope that one day we shall see him again and enjoy his friendship. Though there is always certain sadness as we disperse, the mercy of God will gather us together again in the joy of his kingdom. Therefore let us console one another in the name of Jesus Christ. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Saints of God, come to his aid, patient wait your hands. Receive the soul of his enemies. May Christ who called you take it to himself, and the angels take it to his own Abraham. Receive the soul, presenting to God at this time. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual life shine upon him. Receive the soul, presenting to God at this time. To you, O Lord, commend the soul of Edwin your servant, in the sight of his poor he is now dead. In your sight may he live forever. Forgive whatever sins he may have committed through human weakness. In your goodness grant him everlasting peace. We ask this through Christ. Merciful Lord, you know the anguish of the sorrowful. You are attentive to the prayers of the humble. Hear your people who cry out to you in their need, and strengthen their hope in your lasting goodness. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and perpetual life shine upon them. May he rest in peace, and may his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. And may the peace of God, which is beyond all understanding, hearts and minds, and the knowledge and love of God and our Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. And may Almighty God bless us, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. May we go in the peace of Christ, whose grace and
begin by sharing with you what will be the order of events today. We will begin and end with a selection by the chorus. I myself have chosen the role today of speaking for former students and colleagues who cannot be here. I say that to put you at ease because I will be speaking for a much longer time than the other 8 speakers. Whatever else, in myth or reality, he may or may not have been to each of us and to this wonderful school, the fact is that to his country, Edwin David Barlow was a war hero, and he was damn proud of it. A week ago Friday, on a cold and drizzly overcast afternoon, Ed received the gratitude of his country as he was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors and a 21-gun salute sounding across a misty field. This flag draped his casket on that occasion, and it was presented by His Honor God to Mrs. Lee, who has lent it to us, and we will, after today, present this flag to his brother Albert. I ask you to please join me now in saying our Pledge of Allegiance in honor of Mr. Barlow's heroic military service. Mr. Hart asked Mr. Barlow how it came to pass that he had been wounded twice in the war. Without a millisecond's hesitation, Mr. Barlow growled, "Forgot to duck." And then his eyes and his lips smiled. He won a Purple Heart with 1 oak leaf cluster, a campaign medal with 4 Bronze Stars, a Good Conduct Medal, and this was the extent of conversation I ever heard him say about his war experiences. Would that I could be as modest. Death has a reputation for separating people, but in Mr. Barlow's case, it has also brought many of us together, not only physically here today, but also for our faculty. His death has brought us together in a rededication to the true purposes of why each of us became teachers in the first place. As Mr. Barlow's illness became critical, it became necessary to try and learn if this man had simply mysteriously ridden out of Boston as a solitary person on a mission, or if he indeed was, like the rest of us, an extension of a family. So I began to make calls. No one with the name of Barlow in Massachusetts could escape getting a call from me. Then no post office, police department, or town clerk was safe from hearing from me. All was to no avail, because in truth, no relative of Mr. Barlow's had lived in Massachusetts for the past 25 years. Then I looked upon Mrs. Corrine Healy, who heads the development office at Cathedral High School in Springfield, Massachusetts, which was Mr. Barlow's alma mater. To Mrs. Healy and her extraordinary efforts, we owe all that we have learned about Mr. Barlow's life prior to 1954. If it is true that knowledge is love, and I believe it is, then because of Mrs. Healy, we are able to better love the memory of Mr. Barlow. And the gift she gave to us pales in comparison to the gift that she gave Albert Barlow. Single-handedly, she reunited a family that had been estranged for over 40 years. I'd like you all to meet Mrs. Corrine Healy. After we learned of Mr. Barlow's family and of his early life, and as he lay in a deep coma, I became gripped by 2 fears. One fear was that he would die. The other fear was that he would live. Obviously, I was afraid that he would die because of the affection we all held him. But I was also afraid that he would live because can you imagine what he would have done with me for revealing his past and invading his cherished sense of privacy? I promise you, it would not have been pretty. Let us begin our journey. The following is a letter from his brother Albert. Faculty, students, and friends of Edwin Barlow. I was asked to speak or write some words about Edwin's early life before you met him in 1954. In social situations, with a beer in hand, I'm able to hold my own and even contribute. But at formal occasions like this, you might say the words tongue-tied were added to the dictionary to describe me. So I've taken the invitation to write some thoughts for Larry Green to express for me. Edwin's private, reclusive nature begins even earlier than 1954 when you met him. We, his brothers, were unaware that Edwin had taught at Hinsdale High School in New Hampshire before arriving at Horace Greeley High School, or that he had studied at Yale and Harvard, etc. My latest recollection of him dates from his early years at Holy Cross, and before, and truly not much then. As young children, we received the normal Catholic, taught by nuns, 19th century, crack on the knuckles if you get out of line type of education, which methods were still in vogue in the late 20s and early 30s of this century, and perhaps still are. That last sentence translates into one word: discipline. It may also help explain some of what has been referred to as Edwin's rather stringent disciplinary methods. I'll say this, though, that he was as much of an influence on me, being 3 years younger than him, in gaining a strong respect for education, as any of the nuns we had ever studied under. Usually, we had the same nuns as our teachers. However, in our early years, our age difference separated us into cliques of friends of our own age, and I can't say how he and his friends may have entertained themselves. I do know that he ice skated and played a sandlot type of hockey, as I saw him play a few times. And my own first pair of hockey skates were his, handed down when his feet outgrew them. He wasn't interested in extracurricular activity strongly enough to participate in any organized program, such as high school athletics. He was strongly motivated, however, towards his study, and education was always his number one priority. Edwin was somewhat extreme in his religious attitudes, and the general family feeling was that he would become a priest. On Sunday, between the ages of 12 and 15, he went to 7 a.m. Mass and then to the rectory to open the contribution envelopes of the children after the 8 through 11 a.m. Masses, for which he received 50 cents. During those 3 years, he became very well acquainted with the priests of the parish, and really more in tune with them than with his family. That added somewhat to our conviction about his priesthood plans. When he got to be 15, he began to feel that 3 hours' work on Sunday mornings for 50 cents was a rather low wage, and he asked me if I would take his job. I hadn't yet seen 50 cents all at once, so I said yes, and stayed until I was 50, and so became well acquainted with the same priests. Often they would converse with me concerning what Edwin was doing, and hinting that they also felt that Edwin was headed toward the priesthood. And then came December 7th, 1941. And eventually Edwin went off to do his part, which you are all well aware of. But you aren't aware of the Edwin who returned from this experience. He was non-committal on his exploits and where they were done, and said nothing about his 2 wounds, and probably was starting on the road to becoming the Edwin you knew, if he had not already done so. Any priesthood aspirations had fallen by the wayside. Perhaps he felt unworthy because of what he was forced to do during his army life. But at least he had not lost his appetite for education, and off to Holy Cross, and more or less out of our lives, in order to start a brand new life for himself. Edwin came to you as an only child, he said, and had no remaining family. But even only children grow up and have families. So I think Edwin started his own family at Horace Greeley High School, and the members of it were the thousands of students that passed through his classrooms. The original Barlows of Edwin's family are now almost a vanished breed, but the thousands who made up his new family while under his tutelage had to carry away something of the Edwin they learned from, and his influence is now operating in their lives around the world. Edwin was not a man without a family. He was a man with the biggest family you or I ever knew. I think the war made him formulate a philosophy that killing young people before their time is a sin, and decided when he returned to do all he could to help assure that any future young people who came his way would have every chance to become old people. He may have accomplished it. Edwin is not dead. He's just gone on to start a new class. I hope his new administrator can cope with this administrator's nightmare. I leave it to your own thoughts as to what ideas he has for his new man in improving his new place. Thank you for listening to me and for all you did for my brother Edwin. I would next like to read from a letter that was sent to me from a classmate of Edwin's at Holy Cross University, Holy Cross College. Bill Collins, still a resident of Springfield, Massachusetts, referred to Edwin's life as amazing, heroic, and a bit sad. Interestingly, he points out in his letter how unselfish Edwin had been in sharing his knowledge of the subject matter with any of his fellow classmates who sought help, one of which claims he would never have graduated from the cross without Edwin's help. He also relates a story about Edwin, about a roommate who had persisted with Ed about the fact that he was not being social enough, and had asked him if he would not feel terrible if there was some woman he was interested in and she had married somebody else without his ever having asked for a date. He indicated that there was a woman he was interested in, and that yes, he would really be disappointed if that happened. And the roommate persisted, well, what would you do? And Ed responded, well, like every other fellow, I would go down to the bar, I would have one beer, I would come home, and I would do a lot of math problems. Bill closes by saying that Edwin Barlow was everyone's friend but Edwin Barlow. This is a wonderful high school we have here, partially, I think, as a result of the fact that we've had only 2 principals in the last 41 years. From the principal who hired Ed, Dr. Donald Miles, I have the following to relay that many of you may not know. First of all, Mr. Barlow was always called Blackie during the 50s and 60s and even into the early 70s because of the way he would dress. When he first came to Greeley, he was an extremely avid basketball fan, attended every game home and away, and even, hold on to your seats, coached the JV basketball team. Dr. Miles did not leave him in this assignment for long, however, because Ed used to read a book on the bench as the game was in progress. He frequently had students memorize poems and required that they recite them in front of his class. And during one year, he had been assigned as an extra duty to run detention during that entire year. And he was happy to do so. However, during detention, he taught the students Chinese. Dr. Miles also stressed Ed's extreme generosity and willingness to tutor students here in school at 6 a.m. in some cases, in hospitals, or even at the colleges they attended, and of course, never without a charge. A favorite story of Don's about Ed was that he was sitting, this was in the current Bell School, one afternoon about 3:30, school had been dismissed about 3 o'clock, and a mother came storming into his office looking for her son. And she relayed that the son had not got off the school bus, and she was very concerned, and where was he? And it soon surfaced that he was Mr. Barlow's student. Mr. Barlow was keeping a class after and reciting to them. The woman wanted her son. Dr. Miles advised her to leave the situation be, but as only a Chappaqua mother can, she insisted and proceeded up to the 3rd floor of Bell School, ran to the door where Mr. Barlow was holding forth, stepped into the room, yelled at her son to please come with her, and of course, he never even looked at her. Now, I've had that same experience with Mr. Barlow to a lesser degree when I have tried to get students to do certain things. But Dr. Miles' favorite story about Mr. Barlow is the student who Mr. Barlow became a mentor to, and who, because of his encouragement, went on to attend Oxford University. And he goes on to say, the year after I retired, I was in Oxford and happened to pick up an Oxford paper in which were listed those who had achieved outstanding honors that year. And on the list I saw the name of John Baker of Chappaqua, New York, USA, who had achieved a first, which is the equivalent of maximum cum laude in an American college or university. Mr. Barlow was determined to show those British that the American schools were as good as theirs. A letter from a student of the 50s, Edwin Barlow. I can still count to 10 in Mandarin Chinese, say blockhead in Russian, and recite numerous phrases from Alice in Wonderland and Robert Frost. Myself and my classmates, who graduated in 1960, wrote a song to the tune of The Tables Down at Morris, which I'd like to recite only one paragraph with apologies to Mr. Dunn. We are poor little blockheads who have lost our way. Sob, sob, sob. We are radishes and cucumbers who have gone astray. Sob, sob, sob. Haunted by postulates, theorems, and rules, and by other things learned in school. Blackie, have mercy on such as we. Sob, sob, sob. And it goes on and on. "26 years ago, a young, vivacious Southern woman came to Greeley to teach science. And during Mr. Barlow's recent hospital stay, she wrote as follows. In you, Mr. Barlow, I found the most profound influence in my young teaching career. You taught me that one cannot do more important work than participate in the education of our children. You helped me affirm that students and their welfare should always be central to everything a teacher does. Although I never had the privilege of sitting in on one of your delightfully infamous classes, I still consider you to be my teacher. I just wanted to thank you. Love, Rosalind." Another teacher, John Sweet, said, "I was grateful to him, as were the students, simply for his eccentricity. He relieved the boredom of the place." From a student of the 60s, David Nierenberg. "I always thought Blackie was my most inspiring teacher, for two simple reasons. And interestingly, they were not because we students did well on Regents or AP exams. Blackie treated each student as an individual. He tried to learn what made each student different, what each person cared about, and what he could do to motivate each student. Many people thought he motivated by fear, but I never believed that. I think he found a way to make each student want to do his or her best. This was especially impressive since his chosen subject, mathematics, could easily be a subject in which students could become discouraged. Related to this was his caring for each student. Somehow he found out if you made the varsity team or if you were cut from the JV, or that there was an illness in your family, or whatever. He would pull his students aside, of course when no one was looking, and talk about things that he knew must be of concern. We all knew that he would teach students in class, but in retrospect, I believe that he only taught students who were strong enough and confident enough that he knew they could take it. His caring for each student as an individual, and his ability to bring out the best effort from each student, were the qualities that made Blackie a master teacher. And I'm sure that many of us considered adding teaching to our career plans because of him. Even though I myself am a medical doctor, I have chosen to teach at Dartmouth Medical School because of the example of Mr. Barlow. Another student of the 60s, John Baker, learned of Mr. Barlow's passing yesterday and gave me a call at home last night. Simply, he said Mr. Barlow was unequaled as a teacher and mentor. John has gone on from Oxford to be a teacher at University College in Dublin, Ireland. When John was at Greeley, the tradition was that Mrs. Whitbeck taught the 9th grade math students and that they would have Mr. Barlow as 10th grade. John quoted from memory last night his first class, first day of September of his sophomore year with Mr. Barlow. He said, "This is how the class began. Pencil in hand, he was told to take the following dictation. Thanks to the efforts of Mrs. Whitbeck, there will be no core agenda necessary in the investigation I have concluded so far in the algebra, elementary, intermediate, or advanced, geometry, plain and solid, and analytic geometry." Now that's a beginning of class that even Mr. Hart would like. That's not exactly, "Hi, how was your summer?" John Baker went on to say that he remembers most the fact that Mr. Barlow's favorite poems were poems all about the effervescence of youth, namely Loveliest of Trees by A.E. Housman, To an Athlete Dying Young, also by Housman, and Thanatopsis by William Carney Bryant. I reminded John that there was an incident here when he was here, in which he was late to class, and he was told by an administrator to get with it and to run to class. And he became insubordinate and refused to run to class. And there was a faculty meeting in which John came to explain his actions. And he walked into the faculty meeting and he simply said, "I did not run when Dr. Miles told me to do so because Mr. Barlow told me a gentleman never runs." He also indicated that in 1988, on the 20th anniversary of his class's graduation, some members of the class had created an unholy book entitled The Holy Blackie, containing quotes and aphorisms by Mr. Barlow. I'd like to read The Loveliest of Trees, the cherry now. Loveliest of trees, the cherry now is hung with bloom along the bough, and stands about the woodland ride, wearing white for Eastertide. Now, of my 80 years and 10, 20 will not come again. And take from 70 springs a score, it only leaves me 50 more. And since to look at things in bloom, 50 springs are a little room. About the woodlands I will go to see the cherry hung with snow. Just when the students were beginning to appreciate that poem, I'm sure Mr. Barlow asked him, "Well, how old is the author?" There's a mathematical problem in there if you listen carefully. Of my 80 years and 10, 20 will not come again. I'll leave that with you. A more recent alumnus, David Fine, currently a student at Wesley, wrote to me saying, "Few people learn wisdom in high school. Most people settle for knowledge. But with Mr. Barlow, wisdom was the subject he taught." Just a few weeks ago, as we were studying for our final examinations, the first semester having come to a close, I was studying for a science test with a friend. After we had painstakingly gone through all of our notes and previous exams the night before the test, I suggested that we retire until the morning in order to get what little promise of sleep there was left. She, however, insisted on continuing to study on her own. I said that if you push something so hard into your head, it will fall out the back of it. I know that because when I was in 9th grade, I had Mr. Barlow as a math teacher. He once sent me to the library to write, "I am stupid," 1,000 times. When I was given that assignment, I answered that I gave an incorrect answer to a problem. After that day, my performance improved miraculously. And when Mr. Barlow asked, "Mr. Fine, are you stupid?" the correct answer was no, Mr. Barlow. Mr. Barlow beat it out the back of my head that I was stupid. And now I knew that I was not. That's an interesting theory, David Fine. Mr. Barlow was the kind of teacher, the kind of man that one does not forget. He would mutter Russian and Greek to himself when we would misunderstand something, or he would start to munch on one of the tomatoes which he kept in a big bowl on his desk in the back of the room. He liked to sit in the back of the room so he could see us, but we could not see him. Teachers protest when students look at them inquisitively for an answer, but Mr. Barlow used to follow, "Why are you looking at me? I'm too ugly to look at. Last time I looked at the mirror," and then he would mutter in Greek or Russian, "Go look at Mr. John and Miss Smith." But Mr. Barlow was the kind of teacher who demanded respect. I knew he didn't really mean it when he called me the things he used to call me, or at least I think I knew that. I did know that he was the best math teacher I ever had and ever will have. He used to take a group of students, beat it out the back of their heads that they knew nothing, and then teach them that they knew a great deal. He built us into strong students prepared for the future. Because if one can deal with Mr. Barlow, one can deal with anything. Mr. Barlow was a dedicated teacher who cared. I know this because even 2 and 3 years after I had him as a teacher, whenever I would pass him in the hallway, I would always say, "Good morning, Mr. Barlow." And he always said, "Thank you, Mr. Fine, good morning to you." And there would be a little smile on his face. From Cuffy Stern, 1985 graduate. With the death of Ed Barlow, I lost both a friend and a role model. Few have proven as inspiration. Mr. Barlow pushed his students to overachieve. He helped me explore my own creativity. I am grateful to have known Mr. Barlow, and I will always treasure our fond memories. I offer 2 reflections which highlight the warm and eccentric personality which so many Greeley students found endearing. Just prior to April 1st of my senior year, I devised what I envisioned would prove to be the ultimate practical joke to play on my friend and principal, Ed Hart. At 5:30 a.m. on April Fool's Day, a friend and I marched into school with a toilet bowl and a seat, a large chain and spare combination lock. We planned to lock the eyesore to Mr. Hart's desk and then quickly exit. Unfortunately, the administration building was the only building locked. But my friend recognized a marking on the ground. Leading away from the administration building lay a trail of coffee stains, which could only have been made by Mr. Barlow. Rarely did Mr. Barlow put down his quivering mug of coffee. We followed the trail through the hallways until we reached Mr. Barlow's classroom. I started to stammer as my mind raced for a reasonable explanation of why I needed the administration door open. Mr. Barlow glanced at the toilet. He told me that a silent prankster was an effective prankster. Together we marched quietly toward the administration building. He with his coffee mug and I with my toilet seat. Without a word, he opened the door to Mr. Hart's office and he walked back to his classroom. I thought for a moment that I had detected a smile, but to this day I remain uncertain. While a student in Mr. Barlow's class, I once invited him to dinner. Although he politely declined, the next day after class he handed me a bottle of champagne to bring home. Later in the week, my mother drove me to school early and accompanied me to class. She wanted to thank Mr. Barlow in person. As usual, my classmates and I cowered outside the classroom, afraid to go in early. My mom walked inside and I followed fearfully. I was mortified as I saw my mother plant a kiss upon my math teacher's cheek and give him a hug. By my own embarrassment, pale in comparison to that of Mr. Barlow. His eyes became huge and his rolling cheeks filled with color. I began to smile, but then quickly thought better of it. Not wanting to ruin Mr. Barlow's gruff image, I told nobody of his reactions. Beneath his arm I hid a sweet and gentle man. I am eternally grateful to Mr. Barlow's guidance and support. Too often we forget to express our appreciation until it is too late. I hope and believe that Edwin Barlow recognized the fundamental role that he played in the academic and personal development of so many Greeley students. I will miss him greatly. Finally, comments that were passed to me by one of our current 9th grade Asian students. The death of Mr. Barlow has caused widespread sorrow, not alone among his host of friends, students in general. I recall Mr. Barlow as he was in September 1990, and the recollections are all pleasant. He seemed to me to have the most vigorous intelligence I have ever met, the most capable and the most typical of the general American intelligence at its best. Of that intelligence, which by its sturdy insistence on fact, its practical sense, its solid self-confidence, its independence, its courage, and its honesty, he made Horace Greeley School capable of fulfilling its mission. Withal, he was one of the best of men and teachers, affectionate, humorous, displayed great ability in various activities, a brilliant master of mathematics, and his industry, perseverance, and undaunted energy were amazing. I hold it a great privilege and honor to have been numbered among his students. So do I.
I think Mr. Barlow would want me to acknowledge the very special effort on his behalf by Larry Breen. No one knows the many, many hours that Mr. Breen put into taking care of legal, medical, and final arrangements for Ed Barlow. I'm proud to be a friend of Larry Breen. Every once in a while, someone will come to me and say, I met someone just like you. The first time it happened, I was surprised, but I've come to believe that all of us have personalities and mannerisms that we share with others. You might say that everybody here has clones, but not if Ed Barlow were here. He was uniquely eccentric, a fierce, intense teacher, an extremely private person, a generous loner with a sense of mischief, a man who played his role to the hilt. We are lucky because we experienced him. And each of us experienced him in his own way. As for me, he tolerated me. I worked for him. When I first came here as an assistant principal, I addressed him as Ed. He replied, Mr. Barlow, and called me Mr. Hart. I adjusted, and for a while called him Mr. Barlow. Then I went back to Ed, and he called me Ed. I thought I'd won a small victory until I found out that he had scornfully announced to one of his classes, Mr. Hart calls me Ed, so I call him Ed. There are so many stories. I hate to add another one to the pile, but in this gym, as a beginning assistant principal, I can remember sitting over in the bleachers. And one of my first basketball games, and the kids would line up to take follow-up shots as the opening piece before the game began, the warm-up exercise. And I believe the first boy to take the shot is now a man, a boy by the name of Lee Hildenbiddle. And there was we used to grow up, we used to have quite a large crowd at that time. And Lee went to take his shot, just a warm-up shot, first shot of the game, and he missed it. And it was tremendous roar, went across the gym, and I thought, wow, we have kind of a tradition here to make a big thing of this first shot. And then I found out that hospital, he had to fill out an admittance form. When asked for his address, he said, 70 Roaring Brook Road. 70 Roaring Brook Road will never be the same.
As we all know, that Mr. Barlow was a very different teacher. When I first met him last year, I didn't know who he was. I just thought he was this strange little bagman who just wandered freely and didn't have anywhere to go. This year, I really was able to see who he was inside, though. He was an old man looking for someone to care for him. As I thought he was really just one of those teachers. As I got to know him, he was like a friend. His ideas and words were beyond me at first, but I learned to understand him quickly. He never said to go home and study, but I felt it was right to do so. When I learned he was very ill, I was worried that I would never get to say thank you for what you have taught me. I was never able to, but now I will say thank you, Mr. Barlow, for what you have taught me in math, and I now am very proud of being able to understand the subject of math. Thanks. People who have not had the privilege of having Mr. Barlow as a teacher know only stories. They may say he's mean, which is not accurate, or he's obnoxious, which is also not accurate. Even if these accusations have an ounce of truth to them, so what? The true qualities by which a teacher should be measured are in the name of the profession, teaching. Putting aside Mr. Barlow's eccentric behavior, I would like to speak about the thing that he should be remembered for, his undying devotion to the profession and his students. Before last year, I was in dire need of assistance in math. I learned upon entering the classroom the first day of school that I had better change. For fear of being reprimanded every time I was called to the board, which was fairly often, I went home every evening and studied what we had learned in the previous class. With the aid of Mr. Barlow's unorthodox and extraordinary teaching methods, and my fear of his unorthodox and extraordinary teaching methods, I finally began to excel in math. Mr. Barlow taught me more than math. He taught me discipline. I learned that if I were lax and lazy, I would have to suffer the consequences, which was his wrath. But if I worked hard, I would receive the fruits of my labor, which were his praises. Believe me, it was a lot better to be praised by Mr. Barlow than to be scorned by him. In that classroom, above any other, I learned that my achievements were due to my own actions. Although I said I would not talk about the antics that went on in Mr. Barlow's class, it is just too irresistible. I loved to go to class. Each day, one or more student would be chastised and embarrassed in truly humorous ways. If someone made a careless arithmetic error, he would make the pupil go around to each classmate and recite the correct answer. If the student should happen to smile or laugh, he would yell, "I'm not a dentist, don't show me your teeth." Or if I happened to screw up, he might say, "Mr. Damschick, you are thick, 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 you stupid vegetable boy." This was simply a sign that I should have studied harder the night before. I also recall the day when students asked Mr. Barlow to sign their yearbooks. John Jacot did not have a yearbook, and when he handed him a piece of paper to sign, Mr. Barlow immediately gave him his own $30 yearbook. Every day he asked me to go to the soda machine and get him 2 seltzers, and when I would return, he would give me the change and a couple dollars more. These are merely examples of a little-known but chief quality he possessed. He donated immeasurable amounts of money to the Greeley Scholarship Fund. He wanted to further the Greeley students' education, whether it be in the classroom or with financial aid. I clearly remember the last day of class, when inevitably Mr. Barlow would hand out a photocopied page from the encyclopedia with the heading Marlene and Dietrich. Ms. Dietrich was quoted as saying, "When we are young and stupid, which often go together, we are barely aware of exceptional people." The connection was simply that the reason he called us stupid was not for any personal reasons, but rather because I am stupid, because I am young. Although I am young and stupid, I believe that I am aware of exceptional people. Mr. Barlow was an exceptional person. He who's a lifelong student and believed until you've had a lifetime of experiences, you are stupid. I will be stupid until the day I die.
It's been almost 20 years since I was in this room last, which gives me pause to, I'm not sure what exactly. But I came this morning from Philadelphia because it seemed very important for me to be able to join all of you in remembering Mr. Barlow, who I studied with and also thought of not only as a teacher but also as a friend. This has been quite an experience the past 6 weeks in getting to hear a lot of other people's stories and hear and confirm some of the various rumors that I had known of, or various things that I personally knew about him, but somehow thought I was the only one who knew or had experienced him in those ways. Well, it may seem surprising to some of you to hear a former student referred to Mr. Barlow as a friend, because his reputation is somehow of someone who is so austere, to say the least, that he wouldn't have friends. But one of the things that I most appreciated about Mr. Barlow was that he was willing to risk that reputation that he guarded so closely by making friends with former students as myself. Mr. Barlow took being a friend as seriously as he took his teaching, which is to say that he acted with seriousness and respect towards people years his junior, and he really wanted to know what people thought and what they had to say, and that's quite an unusual thing. Our friendship took the form of a 20-year-long series of conversations and letters. This began when I was a senior at Greeley, and they continued over the years. Mr. Barlow was quite a formal person, as you know, and so he always addressed me at first as Mr. Gluck, and then only later, I guess affectionately, as Robert. In the last couple of years, I've started a new career, having been ordained as a rabbi, and since I haven't seen him since then, but only corresponded, I only could wonder whether he would greet me now as Rabbi Gluck. You never really know with Mr. Barlow. I must add that one of the most endearing things for me about him was that through his serious demeanor, that he had a biting but a very warm sense of humor. And you've heard many stories and know them yourselves about some of these incidences. But I remember one day in particular in a class when I was in 9th grade, when I did have him in math, and he interrupted the class to dictate, yes, one of these poems. And he's claimed to have just written. I don't know where it was quite from. But everybody, of course, had to copy with exactitude the words of the poem, and he checked to see that everybody got it right, and here was the poem. See Sisyphus. See Sisyphus hiss. Cease hissing, Sisyphus. Without knowing it, though, that was it. You want me to say it again? Without knowing it, though, the seeds of our friendship were first set in that math class. When our talks began years later, they began on what seemed to me a very unusual topic, but one that I now know from hearing other stories wasn't so surprising for him. But it was certainly surprising to one who studied with him, and that, of course, was Alice in Wonderland. As a young boy, it was a book that I loved a lot, and it came as an enormous shock when I was in 9th grade to see that my math teacher was reciting chapter and verse from that book in the middle of lessons, and especially, as you know, at those times when he was, quote-unquote, highlighting the behavior of students that he didn't like. I, of course, was one of those students, and nobody was exempt. I was frightened by him and intrigued by him, and of course, as everybody has said, I learned a lot from him. But one of my favorite Alice moments in class was when he offered his comments on the idea of Seminar Week. How long has it been? Is there still a Seminar Week here? How many years has it been? Well, Seminar Week was a time when classes were interrupted and there were special seminars and events that were designed by students and faculty. So one day he brought in a series of interviews that he had from the student newspaper, which he quoted. And he quoted a teacher who was in favor of the week, it was John Sweet, by the way, who called, quote, anyone opposed to the program was a chowderhead. This, of course, referred to Mr. Barlow, who responded by announcing his own Seminar Week in class, and he quoted from Alice in Wonderland, let's play Seminar Week. Our seminar on team, and I looked it up in the dictionary, I can't find it anywhere, will be shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. What initiated our friendship 3 years later was a gift that I gave him. It was a copy of a book of critical essays on Alice in Wonderland that was called Aspects of Alice that I found in London in a bookstore. Somehow I read the book, I put it on the shelf, picked it up one day, and it occurred to me that if there was one person in the world I knew who might possibly appreciate it, it was probably him. I don't even know why that occurred to me. But what followed were many afternoon and Sunday morning conversations. These were the ones at 5:30 in the morning when he finished the New York Times crossword puzzle. And they began with literature, especially the imaginative literature that I liked, in which he said that he knew and loved when he was a boy. And later it expanded into politics and religion and the ways in which my education and career were developing. Well, being an educator with very specific ideas about schooling and career, these became increasingly a focus as the years went on, especially because he was deeply concerned that I might squander my intellect by becoming a musician. And there was a definite danger that that might have happened. In fact, it looked like that was indeed happening. Nevertheless, he was well-humored through all of it, and always caring even when my choices weren't his, which was often the case. And through my years of college and beyond, he continued to serve to me as he has to others as a mentor, which I, of course, greatly appreciated. What I remember best about Mr. Barlow is something that really hasn't been alluded to this afternoon, which is his smile. Well, actually, he had two smiles. One was a warm smile that he enthusiastically greeted me when he saw me, and I had the unusual experience of coming to visit him before classes were out and being invited in and actually witnessing these classes that I so trembled during back in 9th grade. The second smile was the caring, disapproving smile, which really meant, come now, you don't really expect me to take that seriously, do you? Well, Mr. Barlow may have been circumspect about many things, but his opinions would often leak out in this way through his smiles. He remained my friend because I never doubted that he was well-intentioned and that he deeply cared about people. I never doubted that Mr. Barlow viewed people with profound underlying respect and honor. I know that this was difficult for many people to see. Mr. Barlow wouldn't have selected the same words that I used. He would say rather that he cared most about the truth. But the underlying meaning, I think, is the same, for the enormous potential he saw in the human intellect was his truth. It's difficult for me to talk about him in the first place because I imagine he'd be turning over in his grave and hearing people speak about him and talking about his personal life, but also because it's difficult because I never had the chance to say goodbye to him. His last letter that he sent me, he led me to believe at least that he knew that I was living a life worthy of his respect. And I want to quote just a couple of lines from the letter he wrote me just before my ordination in June 1989. And he wrote, "I'm delighted at the reception of one of my students into the clergy, the only occupation superior to teaching, but then rabbi does mean teacher. Be the best, Robert. Respectfully, Mr. Barlow."
I'm Jason Braun, a former student. In a history of mathematical failures, Mr. Barlow was my only success story. I entered his Regents 9 class, unmotivated, no interest in elementary algebra or any other math for that matter. I'll never forget his first words to the class. "Shut up," he said. And for the rest of the year, there was order. "This is a course in elementary algebra," he dictated to us, our sweaty freshman palms nervously writing down every spoken word, not daring to think of the consequences. If we stopped. I went back to my parents crying that first day, begging my father to remove me from the class. I hate him, scared him. On the advice of Mr. Hart, I decided to stick it out for a couple of months. In time, fear and hate became respect. Respect became fondness. I and the rest of the class began to notice an uncanny sense of humor, a bottomless well of intelligence, and a very effective teaching style. Needless to say, I stayed in the class. Sometimes Mr. Barlow would keep me after class, and we discussed parapsychology, drama, or Stephen King books. To this day, I can't even think of King without fondly remembering our discussions. In scored in the 90s on my Regents and an A for the year. This coming from the anti-math student, the boy who refused to see X as anything but a letter. When people would congratulate me, I'd say it was due entirely to Mr. Barlow. Over the years, we'd have enjoyable discussions during our free time. After I graduated, I went back and visited him. There was so much I wanted to learn about him, and he revealed practically nothing. I learned more in the 20-minute discussion I had with Albert, his brother, than I did in the entire 6 years that I knew him. It's so hard for me to believe that he's gone. To be honest, I thought he outlived us all. I remember so much of what he said, his quotes in Russian and French, his jokes, his telling me to be careful in New York, his telling me to write the word no 1,000 times, how he told me I should get a patent on my hair. His memory is so etched upon my mind, I still feel like I can go visit him in J Building. I have to keep telling myself I can.
Time devours men and events. Its movement is steady, inexorable, merciless. It defeated Edwin David Barlow just as it will defeat each of us. He had been in failing health for several years, dying to be precise, for months. In this he kept his counsel as he did in all matters, refusing to discuss it with anyone. This has been a devastating period this last 16 months for the faculty of the Chappaqua schools. From September 1989 through December 1990, there have been 6 deaths among the Chappaqua faculty. First there was Charles Pollock, a longtime teacher of business education. Next came Alice Runyon, historian and genealogist. This autumn we lost William Snyder and Vivian Ellis and Agnes Boudreau. All were retired from teaching for 5 to 15 years. We are here today to pay tribute to the memory of one who did not retire, would not retire. You who were his students this year, or last year, or 3 years ago, cannot imagine Mr. Barlow in the prime of life. You remember an old man with long gray hair shuffling along who usually had to rest partway up the flight of stairs or on his walk over to the office. Although his body was failing him, his mind remained as vibrant as ever. I'd like to share some thoughts about Mr. Barlow, the first of which come from one of the rare interviews he provided the Greeley Tribune in 1984. Close your eyes and picture the Mr. Barlow you knew and listen to some of his own words. I received my bachelor's degree in physics at Holy Cross and my master's degree in education at Harvard. Neither experience did anything for me as a person. I was the same person when I went into college as when I came out. As far as teaching, I knew I was going to be a teacher. The question was whom I could emulate when I became a teacher. Ralph Beatley, a mathematics professor at Harvard, was worth emulating. This guy knew his stuff cold. One particular instance in his class demonstrates exactly what I mean by education. There was a student who asked me what Ralph Beatley had just said because he had not heard. I told him, and then Ralph Beatley demanded, "Is there a problem?" Ralph Beatley ran the class. If there was a fire and the student next to me was burning, I wouldn't say a word. When asked why he became a teacher, he replied, "I believe that teachers are born, not made. To put it in the philosophical context, I subscribe to the theory that everyone who shows up in this world has a vocation. If you fight that feeling, you'll be unhappy. If you don't, you won't be unhappy." He was asked, "How would you like to be remembered by your students?" "I'd like them to be aware that I provided them with what they needed, whether or not they wanted it. If they want to continue in mathematics, they have the preparation for it. It is better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it." Back in 1984, he was asked about his future plans. "Very shortly, I'm coming to that time when I have to retire. When I find that my health makes it impossible for me to meet my responsibilities, I will retire. After I retire, I want to go somewhere where there's no snow, Florida, California, or maybe Europe. Then I'll get a job teaching at a college, maybe 1 or 2 classes a day. I have no outside interests. I plan to stay in education for the rest of my life." I knew Ed Barlow nearly 30 years. I don't know whether any of us can say we knew him well. He wouldn't allow that. I wish now that I had tried a little bit harder. We did share some quiet moments over the years, and I thought I would tell you about one of them. One day we were sitting after school just talking, and it was probably near the beginning of the school year, October or maybe early November, and I would say it was probably about 1965 or 1966, and I was a rather young, inexperienced teacher, and to me, he looked like a veteran teacher. I realize now he wasn't as much a veteran as I thought. Ed went on and on and on for many minutes about a student that he had in class whose name has come up today and who was even quoted by Mr. Green. And he really was quite effusive as to how deep this student's thoughts were and how humble this student was in the manner of expressing them. And I listened and listened, and when he finally wound down, he had never mentioned the name of the student, I said, "Well, I know exactly who you're talking about. You're describing John Baker." Well, at that point, Mr. Barlow almost fell off the chair. He couldn't believe that anybody else could recognize these qualities. I didn't think it was difficult at all. John Baker was really something special as a student. And the excitement that Mr. Barlow exhibited at that point really almost exceeded any excitement that I had ever seen at any other time. Well, I thought the incident was over, but the next day when I came out of school, in the front seat of my car was a plainly wrapped package, which turned out to be a gift with no card, but I knew immediately where it came from, and it had, of course, come from Mr. Barlow. That student went on to study at Oxford, and of course, John Baker's name has been mentioned several times today. You who knew him have been truly blessed. You will remember him the rest of your days, and well you should, for he gave every ounce of his strength to you, his students. I've always been proud to call him colleague for his intelligence, his dedication, and his devotion to teaching knew no equal.
I never had Mr. Barlow as a teacher, but I developed a strong relationship with him. I knew him in terms that not a lot of others knew him. He was my friend. I'd just like to share with everyone the way I knew Mr. Barlow. Last year I had free during ABC. During this time, Mr. Barlow used to sit outside on the bench where the smoking section used to be. I used to sit and talk with him for the whole time. He was a brilliant man. We have conversations about everything: school, other students, college, music, and he spoke of how he never liked listening to it. Often after school, I'd miss my bus, or I'd be in detention and didn't have a ride home. Mr. Barlow was never hesitant about giving me a ride home if I needed one. I'm not attending Greeley this year, but I'm often here at the end of the day. A major part of my visit would always be seeing Mr. Barlow. We would just stand and talk for a little while. People would always ask me, "What does he talk about?" I would just say something like, "I don't know. What do you talk about? He's human. He talks about whatever he wants to talk about." People built him up to be this big mystery figure. He was human. He spoke about things that everybody spoke about. He just had a very unique approach towards life. I hated hearing how kids were afraid of him, or hearing all the myths about him, which were really stupid and obviously false, such as the myth that he slept in the office. What I hated even more was how people believed all the garbage. When I visited him in the hospital, we had a good conversation in which he told me all he wanted to do was go back to Greeley so he could teach again. He told me that one of the first things he wanted to know was when he could get back to teaching, because he said teaching was his life. He was the most dedicated man I've ever met. He asked me how he looked because he wanted to look healthy so he could teach. He put teaching others ahead of his own health. I just wanted to get the point across that there was more to Mr. Barlow than what most saw. There was a caring individual who dedicated his life to the education of others. He was a great friend, and I'll miss him very much. Greeley will certainly never be the same without him.
One of those unspeakably great days last spring, I happened to be working late. It was about 7:30. And as I went by the faculty room, I saw Ed in there in his sweats, looking just terrible. I wasn't sure whether he was dead or alive. I pulled open the door and I said, "Ed, why do we do this?" He says, "The money, Alan, the money." I first met Ed Barlow in 19 and for the next 32 years, I considered myself to be among his friends at Greeley, but like others who claimed to know him, I seriously deluded myself. None of us got even remotely close to having an accurate fix on him. As I read the obituary Lorraine Dickinson produced from Larry Green's intensive and serendipitous research, I realized that nearly everything I believed true about Ed was wrong. Most of what I professed to know was in fact part of the Barlow myth that had developed over the years of his tenure at Greeley, a myth so pervasive, one could say so persuasive, that no one ever penetrated to its core. As John Baker wrote him 2 years ago, if one believed every rumor ever circulated about you, one would be living quite an extraordinary fantasy. In the aftermath of his death, there are many of us who are still not sure that the facts as we now have them are indeed the facts. Even in death, Ed Barlow remains the enigma he was in life.
What remains, of course, is the legend, and what a legend it is. For 34 years, Ed Barlow was one of the pillars of this school. At his best, he was an extraordinary teacher, brilliant, provocative, demanding, and caring. We may have known little of his private life during his long tenure with us, but there was no mistaking his talent in the classroom or his devotion to his students. The performance standards he set for them and for himself are part of the legend he leaves behind. Neither his eccentricities nor his isolation can obscure the significant contributions he made to this school or his importance to us as a fellow teacher. Edwin David Barlow, we were proud to serve with you in life. We shall miss and remember you in death.